Hey all, welcome to another exciting installment of Ruby Basics. Been a little while since we did the last videos, and in those last videos we looked at variables, and you recall from the YouTube channel that we covered variables in quite a lot of detail actually. So we got some basic user input and then went on to explain the ways that we could get individual pieces of data, let's say. And that's the thing about variables, they store a single piece of data. There are different types of variables, and sometimes that information is variable, it can change, or sometimes it's a constant. But as you've no doubt thought already, at some point we might want to set up collections of data. So what you see on screen here is a way to do that, and that is by using an array. So arrays are very similar across the programming languages, and this is how a very basic array looks in Ruby. Once you go past this, of course, you might want to start looking at databases. But if we've got a basic application where we have a collection of data, and here we're looking at city names, for example, then arrays are a good way to collect that data. So if we want to create an array, it's exactly as we have it on screen. Now, it's very straightforward. We need to give a name so that we know how to reference the array. So when we're calling, hey, I want some data from what? From this array name, right? Straightforward. And we need to say, hey, this thing equals. And Ruby will know it's an array by the syntax. So we don't need, but I'll show you in a second how we do this, but we don't need to say, I'm making an array. But we do have ways to do that. Ruby's a little bit cleverer. And then what we've got here is an array of strings, and the strings are obviously denoted by use of double or single quotes. Each element in the array being separated by, in this case, the separator being a comma. The most basic kind of array. What you'll notice in here is that there's white space here. When we've got white space between New and York, when we've got an array that's separating each of the elements in this way, this is not a problem, and again that's pretty common stuff. So there's no problem in just setting up an array in this way, and of course we can put other types of data in there, which we'll have a look in a second. Now, where there's space in the data, and you choose a different way of structuring the array, you will need to escape the space, because we can use spaces as the separator. And in fact, so if we were to put, say, my city array 2, and we would say it equals, and you may have seen this, right? So that we are going to set up an array with white space as the separator. And in that case, whoops, we would do something like this. London, Milan, New York. Okay, so here's a problem. How is it going to know Madrid and, well, Paris, right, let's leave it there. How is Ruby going to know that this is one piece of data? So as you've said, what you would do is just escape it in this way. Let me just save that down. Interesting. Always makes me worried when we don't get syntax highlighting, but to me that looks correct. I might get caught out when I run this, of course. It's often the way, but that's why we do software testing, hey. So here is a simple way to set up an array, but then we've got this kind of keystroke saving way. And I want to use this %w because do a quick Google for %w lowercase and or %uppercase w, and there's lots of questions around it. I'll come on to explain what the difference is there in a second. Right, I don't think that this is a huge time saver. There is the risk, of course, that you could end up missing off quotes, for example, and therefore it breaks, but really, I'm kind of on the fence about whether this is a good idea or not. However, there's some little bits of magic that lowercase and uppercase w provide us. Now, let's just take this again and let's have a look at what that can be, because again some of this will be familiar. Let's just call this number 3 and we'll do uppercase W. Now, so what's the difference? Well, when you're doing an array like this, the answer is not much, to be honest. I would, probably just use, in fact I'd probably just put quotes around the thing. I don't think it saves that much. If you've got an array with hundreds and hundreds of data points, again you probably want to go more towards a database or some kind of structure like that, not just putting lots of data together in an array. Have a look at this. So if we go, let's call it my math array, for example, and we do %lowercase w, there's our brackets, and what we'll now do is interpolation. And you may remember this, so you may remember this from when we got user input. We're using white space, so there's 3 data points, a 2, an A, and this piece of interpolated code here. And in fact, gets RB, I think, was where we got some basic user input. You'll remember that blog post, and then we used interpolation here to pull in the data from whatever we were calling, and we can do that in the array. So it may be a case that you want to pull in data, say from a variable maybe, and do some some action on it, perform some kind of data data transformation on the input, right? So with %w we're going to be able to do interpolation. Now let's have a look at this actually. So let's use puts. We've seen that before. So it puts my math array. Now what we need to do is index into the array. So puts my math array. In fact, let's just puts my math array. Okay. So none of this should do anything. Ruby should go, yep, whatever. And only here we calling it to action. So let's run array practice and just see what that gives us at this point. Array practice. Okay, interesting. So we've got interpolation, A and 2. Right. In fact, you know what? I've just realised. Of course, that interpolation hasn't worked with the lowercase w. Interesting. It's the uppercase w that we can use interpolation with. Sorry. Hopefully that will help. Hope you remember. It's uppercase w. So we've just seen an error there, but again, I'm not going to correct this video. I'm going to roll with my error there. This is all about software testing after all, and this is a coding error. We've just seen a defect. We've identified the defect, and we've gone back to the developer and said, "Hey, incorrect syntax." So roll on to here. Puts my math array. So now we've put my math array, and we've got all of the values in the math array because we've said just put the whole damn thing. Okay, now what if I just want the interpolation that I know now know is broken? So let's have a look at that. This is how I index. Now, when we index into an array, the first element is 0, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 it would be. So this would be 0. We're using white space as a delimiter. 1 again, and then 2. So let's see what the difference is now. Let's run it again. Okay, so we've only got the first element being 0. Very confusing, but you get used to it. I'll show you a little glitch later on when we index in from the other side. Okay, so let's change this to, let's leave it at my math array, but we will put a capital W now. So a capital W, we expect interpolation to work. So what we should get is 3, right? In fact, let's get rid of that. And so we should get 3A2. That makes no logical sense. It's not some kind of sequence, but let's run it again. And bingo, here we go, 3. So with a capital and uppercase W, interpolation has worked. And the difference is practically that. The difference between lowercase and uppercase is practically that. Remember that this really isn't going to do anything. What the limitation is whether we can or can't use interpolation, and some escape sequences. This isn't the only escape sequence, but for character, but for purposes of this video, we'll just roll with that. And you know, this uppercase lowercase w is the subject of about 50,000 search results if you go and look for it. Go and look for this. Go and search this, Ruby % lowercase or %w. Just search for that and see how many results you get. It's incredible. All you need to remember is, are we or are we not allowing interpolation and the full set of escape characters that we might use. I'll put a link to the Ruby docs that explain that a little bit better. I found a good reference to that that's useful. Okay, so that's the first pieces, and you know what? I think let's carry on. Let's just finish talking about what other kinds of data we can put into arrays. So if we have, let's call this my mixed array, and just like variables, we can have a string. I'll just go for the regular structure here. We can have an integer or a whole number, and we can have floats, these decimal numbers. Right? That's perfectly valid. So if we put my, what did I call it? My mixed, my mixed array. Right. I'm just going to cut this down to 0. Okay, so if I get my mixed array, remember this will give us the entire contents of the array. I should see 3, 2, 1. Let us see. And here we go. 3, 2, 1. That's the 3 from this interpolated value up here, of course. Okay, so you're perfectly free to put the different types of data in there. So just like our variables, remember we can have these in our variables. Now, I said that we just roll on with this syntax, and Ruby knows that we're doing an array, but you can in fact also set up an empty array, excuse me, and we use this array.new. Right? So my empty array, lowercase. There you go. You see syntax error city. My empty array. So it's useful where we know data will need to be held, but you know the user or the system maybe hasn't actually provided us to it yet. So we set up the array and it's just empty. It doesn't have a size, it doesn't have any data, it's just there available to enter data into, to add data, push pop, etc., which we will cover probably after this one. Let's just get an understanding of the arrays. But you can size it as well. So if you had, you know, my sized array, we could say array.new, right? It would look the same. But now we're going to say, hey, you know what? I want to start this array with 5 elements. There'll be blank. There'll be no data. It would be null. It'd be like putting, something like that, right? Just a bunch of empty elements. But you can also do that. So it can be sized, and in that way you might want to interrogate, you know, how big is this array? The value is null, etc. So there's other stuff we can do which we can look at later. Now, the other kind of fun thing is, let's call it my multi-array. My multi-array is you can do multi-dimensional arrays. You could imagine that, in fact, hang on, let me just put something in here. Right, in fact, just for ease, I'm going to use numbers here. Right, I'm going to change this in a second. Rubyists will already be looking and saying that's not right. Right, not said. Right, so perhaps I've got 2 sets of data. This you see could be a person's name, their age, and who knows, ethnicity. And this array could be, you know, the user list array. And so you want to be able to contain them in here in the same array. So arrays in arrays, instead of setting up, you know, I don't know, array number 1, array number 2, array number 2. So it could be user 001, user 002. It just wouldn't make sense. So you contain them all together. Again, be careful with that, because at some point you might want to go and just set a database up, right? But here is a multi-dimensional array. Now, what we need to do is we need to enclose these, let's call them subarrays, into a syntactically correct array. So we need the outer square brackets, and of course these elements need a comma in between them as well. It gets a little bit hard to read, and this is a two-dimensional array, no kidding. And you know, what do you want to do? Go 3, 4, 5? It gets a little bit confusing. So arrays within arrays within arrays. What was that? I've forgotten the film now. Dream within a dream. But how do we get to those then? So this is straightforward. If I just want to put the first element of the math array, I just say 0. But I've got an array inside an array, and it might feel like we want to go put my math, oh no, sorry, not math, multi array, and we might want to go, okay, so we know, for example, this would be 0, right? This is 0, and this element here must be 1. So if I want to get, let's say, number 4, what would I do? I would go 1. Okay, so it goes, yep, okay, I know the array. Do you want all of 1? What do you want? No, I want the 0, 1. Okay, so maybe slightly confusing. Like that. It's tempting to do that, and some languages are like that. Ruby doesn't work that way. It works that way. Okay, so if we run this now, what I expect is to go into this array, go 0, 1, okay, and then what do you want? 1, okay, which I mean 4. Maybe I should have put letters here. That's probably not very clear. 4. There we go, there is 4. And let's just prove that out. So if I go 0, 1, it should be 0, and 1 should be 1, right? So let's just run that again. 1, 1, okay. So we've tested that. So that is a multi-dimensional array. And it might be useful to index in, you know, to get everybody's age or everybody's ethnicity, whatever these data values represented. Now, when we had this up here, I mentioned, let's just change it. What do I need to do? My city array 4. And what I mentioned was, what's my city array 4? We can index in from the end. And to do that, so not the start, but the end. And to do that, we would use a negative number. So we'd say -1, it goes all the way over here. And instead of saying -0, because we start at 0, that wouldn't make sense, right? So we start at -1. And if we do that, we should see Shanghai. Let's save that and run it again. Oops, what the heck? Oh. Okay, and there is Shanghai. Right? So it is possible to come in the other end. What we'll look at later is how we do things like counting, sizing, and I've forgotten the other one now. I'll cover it in another video. So we could say, you know, how big is this array? 7. Interesting. Give me the 5th element. And so I might just go -2. Yeah. Why you would do that instead of just going, give me the 5th element? I'm not sure. Personal syntactic flavour. Just remember, it's 0 at the start, it's -1 if you're coming in from the other end. So, length, count and size, that's the next ones. We will leave this one here as a basic introduction to, you know what, capital W, forget it, just take that out of your mind, as a basic introduction to the arrays. And you can see how these are useful for, you know, getting user input. Remember we did that over here, getting user input, and we could assign these to arrays. We'll look at that in the next video. So we'll look at how we work out whether an array exists, if it's got any data in, if so, how many elements, and we can use those things actually to, you know, count, to get the size, to get the length. There are some quirks with those, which we'll look at, and then we'll look at, well, hang on, what if I want to delete that, or actually I want to put another city in here? Who knows? Who knows? I can't think of one now. Connecticut. Is that a city or is it a state? Showing my ignorance. But there we are. There is the basics of Ruby arrays.